I wasn't looking for evidence of a cover-up when I started researching railroad expansion in 1883. I was tracking the construction timelines, mapping the routes, documenting the engineering achievements of America's westward push, standard historical research, the kind that fills footnotes in academic journals and gets filed away without controversy. But then I found the photographs. Not one or two anomalies, dozens of them. Formal work crew photographs from railroad sites across the American frontier, all dated between 1880 and 1885. And in nearly every image, standing among groups of normal-sized workers, there were men of impossible height. Not slightly taller, not 6 foot, 5, 8 feet, 9 feet, sometimes more. These weren't circus performers. The photographs showed no audience, no stage, no promotional context. These were railroad workers, construction crews, men wearing the same work clothes as everyone else, holding the same tools, standing on the same muddy ground. The only difference was their size. And then, sometime around 1890, they vanished. Not gradually. Not through some documented decline in average height that medical records could track. They simply stopped appearing in photographs, as if someone had flipped a switch, as if the giants themselves had been removed from the historical record with the same efficiency you'd use to erase a mistake from a ledger. This raises a simple but critical question. Where did they go? And that is where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. 1883 sits at the center of something much larger than railroad construction. It is the year when multiple patterns converge. Patterns that, once you see them, refuse to be unseen. Let me show you what I mean. Start with the maps, pull up cartographic records from the 1870s. Look at the interior of Asia. You'll see a region labeled Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Not a small notation, not a vague geographic term scribbled in the margins. A territory. With borders, with cities marked, with governmental symbols indicating organized civilization. Now pull up maps from 1890. Just 10 years later, the label is gone. Not revised, not updated, gone. Replaced with Russia in the west, Qing China in the east, and nameless territories in between, as if an entire civilization had been quietly erased, while the world focused elsewhere. The official explanation claims Tartaria was never a real political entity, just a catch, all term Europeans used for regions they didn't fully understand. A cartographic placeholder. But that explanation requires us to believe that professional mapmakers, the same ones who accurately charted coastlines and trade routes across the globe, suddenly became sloppy and imprecise when it came to the largest landmass on their maps, that they drew borders and marked cities for something that didn't actually exist. Does that make sense? Now add the giants to this timeline. The photographic evidence clusters between 1850 and 1890. The exact same window when Tartaria disappears from maps. Not approximately, not close. Exact, in 1883. Railroad expansion was reaching its peak across North America. Crews were pushing through territories that had supposedly been empty wilderness, and they kept finding things that shouldn't have been there. Vaults, underground chambers, burial structures built with engineering precision that frontier settlers couldn't explain. And inside these structures, they found remains, human remains. Of extraordinary size. The newspaper reports from this period are impossible to ignore. Not because they're sensational, but because they're so casual. So matter of fact. As if discovering giant skeletons was unremarkable enough that it only warranted a few column inches before the paper moved on to crop reports and local gossip. The San Diego Union, 1895. Bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. The New York Times, 1885 7-foot skeleton discovered in Michigan Mound. The Middletown Signal, 1899. Giant human remains uncovered in Ohio. These weren't tabloid publications. These were mainstream newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy, but not particularly controversial. The accounts describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, often found in organized burial sites, frequently accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy and construction knowledge. Then, sometime around 1920, the reports stop, not gradually, abruptly. Discoveries that were once front-page news simply cease to appear. The skeletons that had already been found, many sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study, now officially don't exist. Lost during routine transfers, the institution claims misplaced. Hundreds of specimens, all vanished without proper documentation. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me walk you through what happened in Iowa in 1856, because this discovery encapsulates everything wrong with how we've been taught to understand our own history. Workers were excavating a cellar for a new government building, standard construction work. They broke through the prairie soil at a depth that should have been undisturbed and struck something solid, an arched vault, approximately 10 feet square. Constructed with 14-inch thick walls and mortar so strong, the workers described it as indestructible. This wasn't a simple burial. This was architecture. Engineering. The kind of construction that requires knowledge of load distribution and material science. The kind you build when you are trying to protect something for centuries. Inside the vault were 8 skeletons, all measuring between 8 and 10 feet in length, all described as being in a good state of preservation. The newspaper reported it once. Then silence. No follow-up investigation. No scientific examination. No documentation of what happened to the remains. The vault was presumably filled in as construction continued. The skeletons vanished, and Iowa's official history pretends it never happened. But here is what makes this discovery especially significant. The vault's construction matched architectural techniques that shouldn't have existed in pre-settlement Iowa. The arch design, the mortar composition, the precise dimensions, all of it suggested knowledge and resources that frontier settlers didn't possess. Who built it? When? And why were 8 individuals of extraordinary size buried there with such obvious care? The official answer is silence. Academic institutions don't investigate these questions. They dismiss them as frontier exaggeration or misidentified animal bones, despite the specific measurements, despite the multiple witnesses, despite the engineered vault that required advanced construction knowledge. Now layer this Iowa discovery onto the timeline, 1856, right in the middle of the period when giants appear regularly in photographs and newspaper reports, right when Tartaria still appears on maps as an established territory, right before everything changes. What changed? Consider the architecture, not just in one city or one region but globally. Between 1850 and 1900, massive neoclassical buildings appeared across the world with suspicious uniformity. San Francisco, Melbourne, Chicago, St. Petersburg. Buildings that official history credits to rapid industrial progress and colonial ambition. But there is a problem with that explanation. There are almost no construction photographs. Plenty of images showing completed structures. Almost none documenting the building process. No records of the labor forces required. No supply chain documentation for the millions of tons of stone. No contemporary accounts questioning how these structures appeared with such impossible speed. What we have instead are dedication plaques, opening ceremonies, and official histories written decades after the fact, all following the same narrative template. These buildings represent the triumph of human ingenuity, built by unnamed workers in record time, despite all odds. But what if they weren't built at all? What if they were inherited? What if the neoclassical architecture we see worldwide wasn't constructed between 1850 and 1900, but had always been there, waiting to be claimed by whoever emerged with power after some kind of collapse? Go to San Francisco, stand in front of City Hall. Now go to St. Petersburg. Stand in front of the Winter Palace. Now Beijing, the Forbidden City's outer structures. What do you notice? Not just similar styles, identical proportion systems, the same mathematical relationships between height and width, the same ratios in window placement, the same architectural principles governing spatial relationships. This isn't coincidence. This is transmitted knowledge. Specific technical understanding about large-scale construction, about load distribution, about creating architectural power through precise mathematical systems. And here is the detail that makes conventional explanations collapse. Many of these buildings feature doorways that seem absurdly oversized for human use. 12 feet high, 15 feet high. Not just at grand entrances, but in working corridors where aesthetic excess serves no purpose. We've been told these proportions represent intimidation or grandeur, but walk through these buildings and actually measure the door frames, the staircase risers, the ceiling heights and functional spaces. Then ask yourself a simple question. Who were these buildings designed for? The answer appears in those railroad photographs from 1883. Men standing 8, 9, 10 feet tall, working construction sites, wearing standard work clothes, photographed without fanfare or explanation, as if their presence was so normal it required no justification. These weren't genetic anomalies. They appear too frequently. They're documented in too many locations. They're photographed in too many contexts, and their sudden disappearance from the historical record after 1890 doesn't match any known pattern of population decline. Unless their removal was deliberate. Let me propose an alternative timeline, not as fact, but as a framework that actually explains the evidence. Pre-1780, a global or near-global civilization exists. Call it Tartaria. Call it something else. Advanced enough to build the classical architecture we see worldwide, extensive enough to appear on every major map, organized enough to maintain infrastructure across continents, and large enough, physically large enough, that their architecture accommodates individuals 8 to 10 feet tall as normal members of society. 1780 to 1785, catastrophic collapse. The sky goes dark. Contemporary accounts from New England describe May 19, 1780, as the dark day when midday turned to midnight across the eastern seaboard. Not clouds, not gradual dimming. Absolute darkness arriving like a curtain being drawn. The official explanation blames forest fires, but the darkness extended over 150,000 square miles. That is not smoke from burning woods. That is atmospheric debris from something much larger. What if the dark day wasn't concealing forest fires, but concealing the atmospheric effects of civilization-scale destruction? What if Tartaria didn't gradually decline, but was annihilated in a concentrated period, leaving behind its infrastructure but removing its population? 1785 to 1850, the inheritance period. Surviving or arriving populations claim the empty cities. Russian expansion eastward. European colonial movements. American westward migration. Chinese territorial consolidation. All of them encountering advanced infrastructure that official history would later credit to their own rapid construction. The buildings weren't built by these new powers. They were found repurposed, reattributed. The dedication plaques added decades later. The official construction dates backdated to match the new narrative, 1850 to 1890, the final remnants. The last giants photographed working railroad sites, maintaining infrastructure they understood, operating systems we no longer comprehend. Their presence becoming increasingly anomalous as the new narrative solidifies. Their eventual removal from society, whether through relocation, elimination, or some process we're not meant to understand. 1890 to 1920, historical revision, maps redrawn to erase Tartaria. Encyclopedias rewritten to dismiss it as a vague geographic term. Academic consensus manufactured to ignore the giant discoveries. museum collections quietly archived or lost, newspaper reports ceasing abruptly. The photographs normalized through cropping were dismissed as hoaxes. And here we are, walking through buildings scaled for giants, living in cities we're told were built in impossibly short time frames, ignoring architectural proportions that make no sense for human occupation, accepting narratives that require coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. The evidence sits in front of us. The oversized doorways, the impossible construction timelines, the photographs of giants that suddenly stop appearing, the burial vaults built with advanced engineering, the maps showing Tartaria then pretending it never existed, the newspaper reports that abruptly cease, the Smithsonian's missing specimens, all of it clustering around the same narrow window, 1780 to 1890, just over a century. Long enough for a civilization to collapse and be forgotten. Short enough that the architectural evidence couldn't be fully erased. What happened in 1883? Railroad crews expanding across America found more than empty wilderness. They found infrastructure. They found burial sites. They found evidence of a previous occupant. Evidence large enough that it couldn't be ignored. Evidence that needed to be explained or eliminated. They chose elimination. Not through conspiracy, through institutional gatekeeping, through the quiet decisions of museums about what evidence deserves study and what evidence can be safely archived, through the selective memory of academic institutions that decided certain questions weren't worth asking, through the rewriting of maps and encyclopedias by powers that benefited from claiming these territories as their own discoveries, and through the systematic removal of the most visible evidence. The giants themselves. Where did they go? That question has no official answer, because officially they were never there. The photographs are dismissed as circus performers, despite showing work crews. The newspaper reports are ignored as frontier exaggeration, despite coming from mainstream publications. The architectural proportions are explained as aesthetic choice, despite serving no functional purpose. The burial vaults are forgotten despite requiring engineering knowledge that frontier settlers didn't possess. The silence is coordinated, not through active suppression, but through passive erasure, through questions that simply aren't asked, through evidence that isn't examined, through patterns that aren't acknowledged because acknowledging them leads to conclusions that don't fit the established narrative. But the pattern exists, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. 1883 wasn't just another year of railroad expansion. It was the year when two timelines collided. The old world's last remnants encountered the new world's forward momentum, and someone decided which version of history would survive. The giants in the photographs were real. The vaults beneath Iowa were real. The architectural proportions are real. The maps showing Tartaria were real. The newspaper reports were real. What is not real is the explanation we've been given, the narrative that dismisses all of this as coincidence, misidentification, and innocent oversight. Because if the giants were real, if Tartaria was real, if these buildings were inherited rather than built, then everything we've been taught about our recent history is incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. Carefully edited to remove the chapters that raised uncomfortable questions about who was here before us and what happened to them. The evidence waits, in archived photographs, in forgotten newspaper reports, in oversized doorways that still stand, in burial vaults that official history pretends don't exist, in maps that were redrawn to hide older borders, in the mathematical precision of global architecture that supposedly appeared independently across unconnected cultures. It waits for someone willing to ask the questions everyone else has agreed not to ask. Who built these cities? Who were the giants? Where did they go? And what else vanished with them that we're still pretending was never here at all? 1883 was the year they found the evidence and decided to bury it. Not under earth, but under silence. Under academic dismissal, under the weight of a narrative too established to question. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for the right questions. And those questions start with a simple observation. The buildings are too big. The photographs are too numerous. The newspaper reports are too consistent. The architectural patterns are too precise. The timeline is too concentrated. Something was here. Something we've been taught to forget. Something that left behind cities we didn't build and guardians we don't remember. And in 1883, we found the last evidence, then chose to look away.